uh, Brother Hassan. It is pleasure to be with you to talk about something that I wrote 3 decades ago. Recently, last few years, I've been trying to update the book, so it will be good to revise what I'm updating with you. Well, I'm just moving forward to our presentation. The first topic that I would like to highlight is the concept of Ummah, the way we understand it. You see, it is based on the Quran. And of course, the Quranic teaching was given the practical shape under the leadership of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you know the time period. So when you approach the Quran, this is very interesting. The Quran prepares the mind. You see, I have been teaching courses on rises and falls of civilizations. And when we study any civilization, we study the peak of that civilization. For example, if you want to talk about the Western civilization, you talk about scientific progress. When you talk about Islamic civilization, we talk about Abbasid period. We don't talk about the foundation. And what happens is that Abbasid period comes about 150 years later. The foundation was given by Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you see that it is through the Quranic teachings. And again, I have mentioned here that Ummah comes from meaning source, and it appears 53 times in Meccan verses and 11 times in Medinan verses. The significance of this is that you see that the ground was prepared in Mecca, and the mindset also was prepared through the usages of this term in Meccan verses. And by the time Prophet ﷺ moves to Yasrib, which became Madinatul Nabi or Medina, the first thing he does is that he develops a document. In Arabic, it is called Sahifa Medina. In English, particularly Professor Hamidullah has called it Constitution of Medina. The first article says that the Muslim community, the Ummah that was established, it is composed of the Quraysh who have come from Mecca and names of some tribes of Yasrib, which became Medina. And they become a community or Ummah, min dun an-nas, as opposed to the whole of mankind. So you get a specific identity under the leadership of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it is established, and through the Medinan verses, with the passage of time, slowly it becomes a compact community. Then, of course, he was the leader of the community because it was established under his leadership. After his death, one of his closest friends and follower, Sayyidina Abu Bakr, he becomes the leader of the community, and he is called Khalifatu Rasulullah, meaning that he is representing the Prophet of God. But the fundamental difference is that, you see, the community now has someone who does not have direct communication with God, with Allah, and it is totally with the follower to understand the Quranic guidance, and based on that, under the circumstances, whatever situation they encounter, they establish the community. And this is how the Ummah was established in history. Now I will jump because we have very little time to discuss so many topics. Therefore, if you have any question, we can take it later. Now, I'll just give an an observation by H.R. Gibb. Gibb was a professor of Islamic Studies at Cambridge, and he has a very significant observation about the Ummah here. There were plenty of obstacles, fanatics who vindicated their conviction of being the only true heirs of Muhammad by rebellion and slaughter, partisans of rival claimants of the government of the community, disputes over principles and details of legal development. But it is precisely through these experiences that the concept of Ummah gained in clarity and significance. The point that we need to keep in mind that after all, we are dealing with the human behavior. And human behavior include all kinds of activities. And there are people who are selfish. They want to establish their selfish authority. There are people, those who want to control the weak and poor. But through these processes, and when you look at it, you will see that the development of Muslim community is not very different from other civilizations. And here we should keep in mind that we are talking about, again, human society. It is not an ideal. Human beings are supposed to follow. If they follow the guidance, they will be able to establish a good civilization. So again, I will make a reference to the other courses that I have been teaching, and that is Rise and Fall of Civilization. My understanding of world civilizations is that all civilizations in history are rooted in divine guidance, and Quran claims that. Okay, now let us see how Muslim community has developed in recent times. You see, for about 1,000 years, 1,200 years, there were changes within the community. There were dynastic changes, different dynasties were established. But it was only in the 18th century, I would say, to be specific, in the maybe mostly 18th century, when Islamic civilization was challenged by civilization in Europe. And you can see that, I mean, many historians have identified 1683. That is the time when, that is the year when the Ottomans tried to subdue the capital city of Austro-Hungarian Empire, Vienna, and they failed. And many Western historians that identified that date as the real beginning of the decline of Islamic civilization. But decline and, you see, rise and fall do not occur overnight. It takes time. So different historians have identified different dates for these developments. So I identify late 18th century, and that is the time when European colonialism becomes prominent in the Muslim world. And I'll just give some major developments. Here, I must highlight the scholars who have contributed. In fact, not only contributed, some of them have dominated very, very significantly. And one of them is Hans Kohn. Hans Kohn, I think, was a Hungarian journalist working in the Middle East. But later he became an academic, became professor of at history and political science at New York University. He died in 1971, I think. And he was a Zionist. But that is his personal orientation. But his contributions are very significant here. Just look at the observation that he makes about the development that was taking place in the Muslim world. He says, poverty has existed in Asia and Africa since time immemorial, as it existed in Europe until the rise of liberalism and capitalism, though in Asia and Africa it has, for reasons and geography, been more acute and more ubiquitous than in Europe. As far as historical memory goes, there has been perpetual warfare in Asia and Africa. Western imperialism has brought lasting benefits to both continents. You see, I must say that Hans Kohn either did not read history or he wanted to distort history. I mean, you will not find 100 years war, 30 years war, 7 years war in other parts of the world. It is only in Europe you will find that kind of wars. And also he's saying that poverty existed in Asia and Africa. He does not know the, I mean, just look at 1648, the year that Western civilization gives some kind of foundation of their growth, is the Treaty of Westphalia. The same year you see in India, Taj Mahal is built. Just compare the situation, the wealth that India had as opposed to Europe at that time. So the point I'm trying to make is that when you read these books, you have to be careful. What has happened is that Hans Kohn guided many Muslim scholars who became, I mean, did their PhDs in 50s in Western universities. And many of these Muslim scholars were guided by him. And these scholars later became the main, giving foundation of what we have seen nationalism in the Muslim world. So this is what I would like to highlight, that Hans Kohn was a historian accepted by almost everybody, but he was faulty. And their main fault is that most of these, I mean, go to any discipline, political science or economics or anthropology or law, most of the time what you will see is that they will identify the beginning of their discipline only in Western Europe. They don't see the civilizational growth in their understanding. Then here I'm quoting from Oxford of India, Oxford History of India. I'm taking this because Bengal was one of the first colonies, direct colonies of British East India Company. And this is what Oxford History of India records. It says, the sudden affluence of company's Bengal servants had a variety of results. It started a stream of returned Indians. I remember when we were young in the 50s, I mean, we used to hear people coming from England, coming back, Velat Ferat, they used to say, coming back from England, and they had disqualification. But look at what was happening in England in the 18th century. They, going back from India, they were becoming nabobs, meaning that if you look at some of the paintings of that time when Robert Clive went back, he was dressing like a Muslim Nawab. In other words, they were influenced, they were copying the way we copy today, Western dress. They were copying Muslim dress because they thought that they used to be part of the elite if they do that. Now what happened is that this East India Company became slowly a parliamentary force by 1767. You see, these days in American politics, you will hear a lot about lobby groups. This is how everything started in the 1760s with East India Company becoming a parliamentary force in British politics. And of course, you will see that similar situation in North Africa of France, Netherlands in South Asia, Russia in Central Asia, similar things. Now, what happened is that as soon as the British occupied Bengal, that was, depending on how you define the dates, is 1757 or 1765. 1765, they got the Diwani, they used to call Diwani from the Delhi emperor for Bengal. It was given to East India Company. Diwani means that they got the right to extract tax from there. And it is through this process, you will be, I don't know whether you are familiar with this or not. 1781, Calcutta Madrasa was established by Warren Hastings, the second Governor General of East India Company in India. Why Madrasa? Because law of the land was based on Sharia, and they needed to run the judicial administration, and that is why they needed this. But at the same time, the British also started to plan to replace the Muslim elite. And of course, during their penetration, there were those, Muslim elites fought and of course lost. And the British now was planning to replace the Muslim elite with Hindu elites. And this is what you will see in the 19th century. They call it Bengal Renaissance. You will find literature on that. And through this process, you see that slowly European ideas started to penetrate into the Muslim world. Now, again, I'm quoting Hans Kohn because his ideas of nationalism became most prominent in the literature of nationalism. Now, those who have studied nationalism, you will see that there are two major scholars of nationalism. One is Hans Kohn, the other is Carlton Hayes. Carlton Hayes was very fair. He was Catholic, and he wrote mainly on development of nationalism in Europe. But Hans Kohn brought Muslims into the discussion of nationalism. But if you want to understand what nationalism is, you have to study Carlton Hayes. Carlton Hayes gives a better understanding of the idea. But because Hans Kohn dealt with nationalism in the Muslim world, his books are, his ideas are dominant in the development of nationalism in the Muslim world. And this is what you see. I don't think that I will have time to read all those things, but I'm just highlighting it to you. Maybe Brother Hassan can give these PowerPoints to you, and then we can discuss later. But I'll just highlight this point, that the truth which men will defend with their lives is no longer exclusively religious. So slowly, religion was being transformed in the form of nationalism. And nationalism is an idea which is not only material, you have, territorial identity, but it is also spiritual, because in Europe also, that is why you need to study Carlton Hayes, that in Europe also nationalism did not become popular immediately. After the French Revolution also, it took some time for nationalism to become prominent in Europe. And this spiritual force that European nationalism adopted, it was through the experience of 19th century Europe. Now, this idea of Hans Kohn now was popularized by Rupert Emerson, again political scientist from Harvard University. And he is saying this: the characteristic feature of the national era that for most men, the national allegiance takes precedence over all other claims which may be made upon them when they are confronted with alternative choices of allegiance. And I mean, particularly at the time of war. In other words, it is through this war, nationalism became popular in Europe. Now, what happened in the Muslim world? In Muslim world also, war was responsible, but the difference was that in Europe, particularly in the case of Germany and Italy, you see nationalism was, I mean, a very significant force against the French, particularly in Germany, also in Italy, against Germany. But in the Muslim world, it was the colonial power. And you will see some of the points I will make at the end when we talk about clash of civilization. Now, Muslims now, as we said, that the British in India was trying to replace the traditional elite. And Muslims now felt that they must adopt some European ideas in order to compete with Europe. And the idea that they adopted, and many scholars, including Bernard Lewis, have identified the French Revolution as the period when Muslims started to accept European ideas. But no matter what it is, I mean, how they took the ideas, it is sometime later half of the 19th century, this process started. And later half of the 19th century, I have identified these three scholars here: Namik Kemal in Turkey, Mustafa Kamil in Egypt, and Sayyid Ahmad Khan in the subcontinent. And all these are later half of the 19th century. But what is interesting is that all these scholars are very committed to the fundamental Islamic values. Like for Namik Kemal, the parliament would be called Shurai Ummah. Mustafa Kamil, of course, Egyptian, and Egypt at this time was still officially part of the Ottoman state, but it was controlled by the British. So when he fights against the British, he's saying that we should get back the Khilafah of Ottoman Khalifa. And of course, situation was different in the Indian subcontinent. Muslims were in a desperate situation at that time because the way things were moving, Sayyid Ahmad Khan noticed that if the British leaves, Muslims will be in trouble because 80% of India remained non-Muslim under 1,000 years of Muslim rule. And that is when he comes forward and starts talking about how Muslims could survive with the challenges they were encountering from the British colonialism. And during this time, many scholars introduced this, and that Hubbul Watan min al Iman. It is not as quoted as it used to be in the later half of the 19th century and earlier part of the 20th century. That period has, we have passed through that period. Now, what happened is that now the early scholars, late 19th century scholars, were committed to Islamic values. But the beginning of the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, you see that these scholars, they are mostly confusing. Ziya Gökalp, who gave the foundation of Turkish nationalism, he identifies three identities. One is Turkish nation, one is Islamic religion, the other is Western civilization. And he says that he could be part of all three identities. And of course, we know that how confusing it was with the later development of situation in Turkey. But this is very interesting. Around the same time, Iqbal gave a very good understanding of nationalism. In other words, the point that I'm trying to make here is that if you are interested in accepting European ideas, there are civilizational values you can identify in every civilization. And it is through this process that you can, live and let live. You can accommodate civilizational differences and live together. So what Iqbal is saying, I cannot read from the, I'm reading from my own notes here. I'm emphasizing this point because Iqbal is very important for us to understand. It is not the unity of language or country or identity of economic interests. I think he has communist movements in his mind when he talks about this, that constitutes the basic principle of our nationality. It is because we all believe in a certain view of the universe that we are members of the society founded by Prophet of Islam. Islam abhors all material limitations and basis of nationality and purely abstract ideas objectified in a potential expansive group of personalities. It is not dependent for its life principle on the character and genius of a particular people. So he's saying that these particular identities that we have, like Turkish, like Persian, like whatever, Indian, this is natural. And he's saying that he's accepting the idea of nationalism, saying that for the present, every Muslim nation must sink, her deeper self, temporarily focus her vision on herself alone. Temporarily, just notice this. And then he says that when they become powerful, they will all become a family of republic. And you see that he's saying that these racial rivalries are adjusted and harmonized by the unifying board of a common spiritual inspiration. You see, he is giving the solution to what we see today, the differences in different various nationalities. He's saying that when they have developed all of them, they can develop a League of Nations. League of Nations, he's saying, because he's talking at a time when League of Nations was established already. And of course, United Nations was not established at that time. It was League of Nations, and he's saying that League of Nations of Muslim states. And later, I would say that OIC was established based on this idea of Iqbal. And then another leader around the same time, Sukarno, gives this understanding of his. He is a little bit left-oriented, communist-oriented, and he's trying to adjust Marxist idea and Islamic idea in Indonesia. In other words, he accepted Indonesian nationalism, but within Indonesia, he's trying to develop some kind of unity. And you will find that similar ideas in Egyptian Jamal Abdel Nasser, and to an extent some other Muslim leaders around the world adopting those ideas in the middle of the 20th century. And this created a crisis of identity. And here, it was only in the middle of the 20th century, after the Second World War, Muslim nations started to emerge. And when Muslim nations were starting to emerge, by then they had already adopted this so-called secular nationalism. And this is what another Orientalist identifying this, and I'm quoting him, "We witness today vulnerable Islam gradually giving way before secular nationalism." And again, he gives, but more interesting is the observation by Bernard Lewis, and he is comparing the growth of Muslim states with the prophetic time, and he is comparing nations with Al-Lat and Al-Uzza, and he's saying that this time races, nations are winning, idols that seem to be victorious. And this observation he makes based on, he has a famous book, Emergence of Modern Turkey. And based on his Turkish observation, he makes this comment. And here I'm quoting a Turkish scholar. I think she is still active in Istanbul. And she is making this observation. Religion was used as an effective tool for social and political mobilization. So expectation was that religion will be used, and then when Muslim states will come into existence, the religion will take the back seat, like in Europe. And therefore, you can generalize the human behavior. What has happened in Europe must happen in the Muslim world as well. But this was the main challenge. The challenge was that it was, I'm going to quote in a while about, this challenge we'll be talking about in a while, that how nation states were challenging, but I'm just going back to the developments that happened in the Muslim world. And these parties came into existence. Justice Party under the leadership of Süleyman Demirel in Turkey. You see, what is interesting is that when he goes into election in the 60s, after the military takeover again, after they executed Menderes, so-called Kemalism had already established that the foundation has to be based on Kemalism. But within Kemalism, there is no scope for saying that we want to practice religion. And as a result, what happened was that superficial ideas. The village in which Süleyman Demirel was born It is called Islam Koy. Koy means village in Turkish. So because he was born in Islam Koy, he deserves the sympathy of Islamic, uh, those who believes in Islam. Also, his father had gone to Hajj. At time, of course, it was rare for any Turkish individual to go for Hajj. Since his father uh, went to Hajj, he became a kind of popular figure to get votes in the name of Islamic identity. So it is love for Islam. Now here, this observation by Ishtiaq Qureshi is very important. It's important because what he's saying is that after the creation of Pakistan, Iqbal's idea did not prevail. Pakistan became just another nation state. And it's a long quotation, I'm not going to read it, but you will see that what happened, he's saying that subtle European suggestions conveyed through literature and textbooks were permitted to play their role unhindered. So you see, there is nothing wrong studying about the West, literature produced in the West, but one should be careful how those ideas, in other words, as I mentioned about Hans Kohm's observations, those observations or Rupert Emerson's theory of sociological development of nation state system, they were accepted without any challenge. So that is the fault of Muslim scholars. Muslim scholars did not stand up on these literature, which he's saying that were uh, permitted to play their role unhindered. And Ishtiaq Qureshi, you know, I don't know, I mean, you should know that he was Vice Chancellor of Karachi University for more than a decade, and also was Education Minister for a while. And this is something that he observed before his death. He died in 1979, I think. In the late 70s, he wrote some books, and this is his observation around that time. But more interesting is the observation by Professor Fazlur Rahman. He says that if there are today practically and indeed dangerously two nations in Pakistan, it is not only because the religious leadership had little contact with the demands of modern society, but even more so because the cultural bastardy of westernized classes. Here I have brought, it just came to my mind that I add these two personalities in Pakistan. You see, when Musharraf took over through a military coup, many of you would remember that he used to bring his dogs during his press conference or to demonstrate that he is a liberal Muslim. He is not that kind of sold out, I mean, conservative Muslim. See, the point here I'm making is that those who were educated in this Western educational system, and Fazlur Rahman very rightly suggests that it is cultural bastardy that they adopted. And something that is very relevant now that Taliban came up in power in Afghanistan a few days ago, when America started its war on terror, he threatened Pakistan. That Pakistan, I mean, the President Bush threatened Pakistan that if Pakistan did not join the Americans, you are either with us or against us. I think this is the slogan that he had developed. The point I'm making is that it is because of this inferiority complex and cultural bastardy that Fazlur Rahman talks about. This class that was established, it is not only in Pakistan, in many Muslim countries, you will find this kind of personalities. And these personalities are those who have led the country so far. Now, Islamist challenge came. And the education system that we are talking about, you know that in Pakistan, Sayyid Maududi came up with his idea of integration of knowledge. And then, of course, among the scholars like Ismail Faruqi or Naqib al-Attas in Malaysia, they came up with this idea of integration of and Islamization of knowledge. And this is because when, as we have quoted Bin Naz, saying that Islam was expected to take the back seat, but Islam did not take the back seat. Some movements came up. And these movements came up with this so-called Islamism. I'm quoting Oliver Roy here because he makes a good observation here that these movements, Sayyid Maududi in the subcontinent and Hassan al-Banna in the Arab world, came forward with this idea, which Oliver Roy calls political ideology. And these movements were suppressed very severely. And we know the stories of how Ikhwan was suppressed in Egypt. And you will find similar efforts, similar actions were taken in many other countries. So what happened? This, in these countries, Pakistan, Turkey, in all these countries, you see that some kind of challenge to the nation state system started to come. And therefore, the point I'm making is that this was an indication of failure of the nation state system. And of course, the establishment of the OIC also was a part of this feeling that you can go transnational and establish an identity based on the Islamic Ummah concept. And again, I'm quoting Gibb here, and he's saying that it was after the abolition of Khilafah in 1923 in Turkey, conferences were held to revive the Ummah identity. There were conferences in Makkah, conference in Cairo, and then followed by another conference in Jerusalem, with all based on this. The Muslims did not forget the Ummah identity. And therefore, you see that some kind of conflict emerging through this process. And this charter that OIC had established, the charter is looking for solidarity among Muslim peoples. OIC was established in 1969. And slowly, some kind of effort, you can see that in the 1970s, Islamic banking and some kind of Islamic education, all these movements gearing up. based on contributions of these two individuals, Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Maududi. And very interestingly, new developments that occur. And here you see Bernard Lewis wrote an article in 1990. Why 1990, this article? Because Soviet Union fell in 1989, it collapsed. And it is at this time that Bernard Lewis comes forward and suggests some kind of this. In fact, this term, clash of civilizations, was extensively used by Bernard Lewis and in his article on this. And this is where he say, this is what he says in 1990. It should now be, it should by now be clear that we are facing a mood and a movement far transcending the level of issues and policies and the governments that pursue them. This is no less than a clash of civilizations. The perhaps irrational but surely historic reaction of an ancient rival against our Judeo-Christian heritage, our secular present, and the worldwide expansion of both. It is crucially important that we, on our side, should not be provoked into an equally historic but also equally irrational reaction against the rival. Bernard Lewis is very cunning, and he is suggesting this when Soviet Union was collapsing. And he was bringing this idea of clash of civilizations, which later, in a few years' time, Huntington takes over and makes these, theoretical foundation for what they call clash of civilizations. Why clash of civilization? Because you'll see that in Huntington's book, he says that after the collapse of Soviet Union, there was a need for direction for foreign policy makers in Washington, and he wrote his book to guide them. And the road was cleared, intellectual road was cleared by Bernard Lewis, saying that this new road is identifying civilizations. And here, conflict in civilizations and find new enemies. He says that Muslims are, because his main focus is to develop how the relationship between Islamic and Western civilization should go. He says that about Muslims, that convinced of the superiority of their culture, but obsessed with the inferiority of their power. You see, this is the response. You will see in a while, I quote Huntington, that from 1970 onward, he identifies that there is more awareness among Muslims. You see here, I quote him, yes. Beginning 1970s, Islamic symbols, beliefs, practices, institutions, policies, organizations won increasing commitment and support throughout the world of 1 billion Muslims, stretching from Morocco to Indonesia and from Nigeria to Kazakhstan. In 1995, every country with predominantly Muslim population was more Islamic and Islamist culturally, socially, and politically than it was 15 years ago. And that was the main, you know that this is the result of the movement of Sayyid Maududi and Hassan al-Banna. But this was seen as something like a threat to Western culture and Western civilization. And Bernard Lewis continuously wrote. He wrote this book, What Went Wrong, A Clash Between Islam and Modernity in the Middle East, 2002. Roots of Muslim Rage. With the same title, he wrote the article in 1990. Then he developed it as a book, Roots of Muslim Rage. Then Crisis of Islam, Holy War and Unholy Terror. So these terms, terrorism and war on terror, all these things, they were coined at this time. And of course, both Huntington and Bernard Lewis had hundreds of followers in the media, and it is through them that this idea that class of civilization was introduced. Now here I have, now what is interesting is this observation by Huntington. He says that 50% of wars involving pairs of states of different religions between 1820 to 1929 were wars between Muslims and Christians. Just look at his data and history. He's identifying about 109 years. And during 109 years, 50% of the war he counts, and they were between Muslims and Christians, as if these wars were between Christianity and Islam. You know that these wars were all colonial wars. These were all wars of independence against European penetration of the Muslim world. And again, foolishly, many people accept this kind of data. And if you look at world population, Muslims and Christians make almost 60% of the total world population. And if they fought 50% of the war, that means they fought less. And yet he's making this argument in order to make the case that there is a case that West must develop a strategy to fight Muslims. And the Clash of Civilizations thesis was introduced. Then he makes this observation: since 1979 Iranian Revolution, an intercivilizational quasi-war developed between Islam and the West. And then he also says, problem for the West is not Islamic fundamentalism. It is Islam, a different civilization whose people are convinced of the superiority of their culture and are obsessed with their inferiority of their power. In other words, these are all attempts to create this division within the international relations, that there is a clash. We know that what has happened in the last 20 years. 9/11 came. Now, I see that most of our friends make reference that 9/11 was caused by Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda was given shelter by Taliban, and therefore you fight. Now, of course, there seems to be new situation developing, but what I have tried in my presentation is that look at the background of last 200 and 250 years to today, that superficial ideas have been introduced through literature in history and political science and economics and law. And this artificial conflict has been developed. And the whole world is suffering from this. So the point I'm trying to make is that, of course, among Muslims, there is always a tendency to blame others for what they are suffering from. Of course, others will definitely take advantage of your weaknesses. I would say that we have not developed, we have not done our own homework to create consciousness among our youth. Just imagine how much we are aware of international situation. And we are, I mean, of course, one must not forget the fundamental acts of ibadah. But I have a strong feeling that ibadah will not be complete without an understanding of international affairs. So this is my attempt to create some kind of understanding of what world civilization, international situation existing today. Thank you. I have taken exactly 1 hour, so I would like to spend more time